Hello, welcome to this reading of chapter 4 of our book. The chapter begins with a short poem-like thing. If I were God and man made a mire of things, war, hatred, murder, lust, I would sweep him to one side and start anew. I think I would. If I did this, would I be God? It's an interesting question. Of course, we know this is not what God did. And that is what the story of the Old Testament is about. What God did instead of sweeping man aside. How did the world begin? Where did man come from? What is the purpose and meaning of life? These are baffling questions that have perplexed humanity down through the ages. But you can find the answers to all these questions in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. These books also answer big questions about God. Who is He? What is His plan for the world? What does He think about me? But you'll notice that the stories mostly address these human concerns by showing what God says and does. As one scholar put it, the Bible does not argue for the existence of God. It reveals Him. You may be surprised to see God presented from many different perspectives, as the mighty creator of the universe, as a loving father who desires an intimate relationship with his children, as a holy and righteous God who cannot tolerate sin. As you begin your book-by-book journey through the 66 books of the Bible, get ready to see the real you revealed in many new ways. As always, let's begin with an overview of the chapter. So your main headings for the different sections in this chapter, which focuses on the books of Moses, or how it all began, start with a section entitled Seeing God in the Big Picture. Next section, 5-in-1 Review. Then, all in a week's work, fig leaves and the forbidden fruit. Your next section is It Looks Like Rain. You can guess what that one's about. Next, a bunch of babbling fools. Then Abraham, the man of promise. And Joseph, dreamer, saves the nation. And Moses, leader and chief babysitter of a new nation. So we begin. Yes, the Bible is a religious book. It wrestles with the deepest questions humans ask about meaning and purpose in life. But the Bible is more than just religion. It's also a historical record of how the world came into existence and how mankind began. This information isn't hard to find in the Bible. It starts in the very first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, Genesis 1:1. In this chapter, we will review the contents of the first book of the Bible. You will be amazed that you can learn about archaeology, science, astronomy, geography, and sociology. No trustworthy book can be true about God, but be false about what God does. Moses is generally credited with writing the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These books are collectively called the Pentateuch. For the Jewish nation, these 5 books are called the Torah, which means the law. Before we review with you the books and the true life stories written by Moses, it will be helpful to understand what lies behind these historical adventures. Moses was not just interested in creating material for children's bedtime stories or Sunday school lessons. That's obvious because some of these stories are way beyond a G rating. We believe that it was the intention of Moses to present God. Let's face it, much of what you can learn about God from the Old Testament comes from reading what God did and how it related to humanity. Through all the books of Moses, we learn a tremendous amount about his character, his purposes, and God is still pretty mysterious in Genesis. As you read this chapter's review of the contents of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, we think you'll find these things about God. First, God is present. He's not just hanging around in outer space. He appeared to Moses in a burning bush, and on Mount Sinai his presence was revealed to the Jews in a cloud and a pillar of fire. He had a permanent dwelling place in the Holy of Holies portion of the tabernacle. God is supernatural. He is the creator of the universe. His miracles reveal that the laws of nature are submitted to his orders. God is a savior. The rescue of the Jews from captivity in Egypt is just an illustration of how God desires to rescue us from sin. God is faithful to his promises. True to his word, God moved in the events of the world to keep his promise to raise up a nation from Abraham's descendants, and his promises will never be broken. God is holy. God's holiness is revealed by his expectation that his chosen people will be holy in every aspect of their lives. God is personal. This may be the most important part about God. He is not a distant alien being who has no comprehension or compassion for you. He created humanity in his own image. He continues to pursue a relationship with humanity and humans despite mankind's rebellion. He is a personal God who knows you by name and is interested in reestablishing a personal relationship with you. Now, with that as a background, let's see how Moses lays it all out. 5-in-1 review. Genesis, the book that started it all. This is the book of the beginnings, of creation, of humankind, of evil on earth, and most importantly, the beginning of God's plan to rescue humankind from its sin. Some of the most famous events of the Bible are recorded in Genesis, including creation, the fall of man, the flood, the Tower of Babel. It also contains the first mention of these names: God, Satan, Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, and Joseph. The name Genesis means origin. Then Exodus, this way out. Genesis ends with Joseph dying in Egypt. Exodus begins 3 centuries later with the Hebrews trapped under Egyptian persecution. In the first chapter, we are introduced to Moses. We see Moses confronting Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and leading the children of Israel to freedom. In the desert, God gives his people the 10 Commandments. Leviticus, a manual on holiness. Genesis and Exodus are packed with action, but Leviticus is, well, to put it politely, a slow read. It is where most Bible reading plans go to die. The book is a collection of God's civil and ceremonial laws for the Jews, which were given to Moses when the Jews were camped at Mount Sinai. God wanted the Jews to live holy lives, with lifestyles separate and distinct from other pagan nations. Their differences in behavior and worship were supposed to be an example to all other nations about the benefits of obeying the one true God. This book gets its name from the tribe of Levi, which was selected by Moses to work in the tabernacle. Numbers, wilderness wanderings. The book of Numbers tells how the Jews moved from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land. The trip should have taken about 2 weeks, but it ended up taking 40 years. The key people in this book are Moses, Aaron, Joshua, and Caleb. The story of the Jews wandering in the wilderness is a perfect example of the covenant God made with the children of Israel. Obedience to God brings blessings. Disobedience brings misery. Obedience to God requires faith to move ahead as he directs. The book gets its name from the 2 times when Moses counted all of the people. Deuteronomy, a final pep talk. Actually, 3 of them. Like a football coach who wants to motivate his team before a big game, Moses, now an old man, wants to psych up the Israelites before they invade the Promised Land and tackle the Canaanites. So he's giving them a series of stirring speeches. The content boils down to the themes coaches use all the time. This is who we are. This is who we're up against. This is why and how we can win. But Moses is dying, so the words also stand as his farewell address. The name Deuteronomy means the second law, because Moses repeated the 10 Commandments, and some other laws, for a second time in his remarks. Now we're ready to look at the other books of the Pentateuch. Sorry, said that wrong. Now we're ready to look at the books of the Pentateuch in more depth. 1 hour cram plan for the books of Moses. There are 1,189 chapters in the Bible. You may think that is too much to read all at once. So as we go through the Bible, we'll be giving you a list of chapters that should be of most interest to you. In the books of Moses, there are some really great stories about God and his people. If you want to finish in an hour, select 6 from the list below, or skim all of them. And so what you have then in the book is a list of chapters. I will read them with the summary statement beside them. So Genesis 1 through 11 talk about the creation. Genesis 3 talks about the fall of man. Genesis 6 through 8 focuses on the flood. Genesis 12, 1 through 9 talks about the call of Abraham. Genesis 22 talks about Abraham's supreme test when he is asked to sacrifice his son Isaac. Genesis 29 through 30 tell the story of Jacob, Leah, and Rachel and their children. Exodus 2 through chapter 3 talk about the call of Moses. Will he stand up to Pharaoh is the question there. Exodus chapter 12 is the next one. The Passover and the escape from Egypt. Then Deuteronomy chapter 1, chapter 5 through 6. These are when Moses tells stories from the wilderness, talks about the spies, the rebellion, and the giving of the 10 Commandments, or the description of that, second description of that. So, all in a week's work, Genesis 1. The Bible reports that God created everything that exists, the earth, our solar system, the entire universe, and that he did it in 6 days. Here's how the account of Genesis breaks the process down. Day 1, God created light. Day 2, God created Earth's atmosphere and water. Day 3, God created land to separate the water into seas, and vegetation was created. Day 4, God created the sun and the moon. Day 5, God created the creatures that inhabit the sea and the air. Day 6, God created animals and mankind. The section entitled When. The 3 questions that people ask about creation are who, how, and when. The answer to the who made the universe is the most important. Only God was capable of bringing about our world. How God did it is next in importance. The Bible tells us that God said, and it happened. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Genesis 1:3. The universe was formed at God's command. Hebrews 11, verse 3. From God's perspective, the least important issue is when. Why? Because the answer is not clear from Scripture. The 6 days of creation could be 6 literal days, or they could be 6 ages. Because in the Hebrew language, the word day, or yom, can mean 12 hours, 24 hours, or a long period of time. And because God can do anything, he could have created everything in 6 milliseconds if he wanted to. When did it all happen? We don't know. the date of creation and the events through Noah's flood are pretty much open for debate. What is not debatable is that the events actually took place and how they occurred. So this book presents a general perspective here that would include a lot of Christians. Christians obviously don't always agree on the exact nature or exact timing of creation, and this is the perspective of those who wrote this book. I'm not sure that I would be as quick to go where they're going here, but that's the perspective they present. Fig leaves, the next section. Fig leaves and forbidden fruit, Genesis 2-3. God's last act of creation was different from the others. The first man, Adam, and the first woman, Eve, were created by God in the image of God. So God created people in his own image. He patterned them after himself. Male and female, he created them. Genesis 1, verse 27. God breathed into man the breath of life. Genesis 2:6. The special imprint that God gave to humanity was a soul, an eternal spiritual element in each human being. It is our soul that separates us from the animals and the vegetation. It is our soul that allows us to connect with God. God created a special paradise for Adam and Eve, in which he called the Garden of Eden. Everything was perfect and complete. Adam and Eve lived in harmony with each other and with the animals. More importantly, they enjoyed a personal relationship with God himself. God considered his total creation to be excellent. When the work of creation was done, God exclaimed, "It is very good." Adam and Eve, seeing a family resemblance. What do you suppose Adam and Eve looked like? They were the first ones into the gene pool. So Adam never wondered if baldness was an inherited trait from his father or his mother's side of the family. The Bible says that Adam and Eve were created in God's image. Think about that for a moment, because there are implications for you. Every person who has ever lived, including you, is a descendant of Adam and Eve. You are made in the image of God. You have dignity and value because of this divine imprint. So the question that comes up from that is, what exactly does the image of God mean? I don't think the image here is a physical thing, since God is spirit and not a man, not a material being. But this is the question. So Adam and Eve choose door number 2. But the perfection didn't last long. Satan tempted Eve to eat fruit from a tree that God had specifically forbidden. Rather than obey God, she chose to gratify her own selfish desires. Adam wasn't any better, because he ate the fruit too. Their actions were in direct and blatant defiance of God's instruction. Rebellion against God is a sin. God is so holy and perfect that sin cannot coexist in his presence. In fact, the penalty of sin must be spiritual death. For the wages of sin is death, says Romans 6:23. Because of their sin, Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden and cut off from their intimate friendship with him. God said that they would suffer physical death, but he had a plan to eventually restore the relationship between himself and mankind that could save humanity from suffering spiritual death. Adam and Eve's sin is bad news for you. They were representatives of the entire human race. Their rebellion against God tainted all humanity with the stain of sin and death. When Adam and Eve sinned, sin entered the entire human race. Adam's sin brought death. So death spread to everyone, for everyone sinned. But the penalty isn't being imposed on the innocent. Each of us has sinned. If we're honest, we know that we are guilty of acts and thoughts that would displease God. For all have sinned and fall short of the of God's glorious standard. Romans 3:23. Don't despair. As we see in chapter 8, God makes a plan to save humanity from the sin virus and its terrible after effects. But God showed his great love for us, Paul says in Romans, by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. It looks like rain. Genesis 6-9. Sin had a predictable, dastardly effect on the human race. Cain, the oldest son of Adam and Eve, murdered his brother, Abel. Following generations were equally wicked. There came a point when the entire population of earth was so perverted and corrupt that God was compelled to destroy them all, except for a man named Noah and his wife. Noah was the only remaining man who obeyed and worshipped God. God revealed to Noah that he was going to obliterate all humankind from its wickedness. Only Noah and his family would be spared. The plan went something like this. Noah would build a boat. The Bible calls this an ark, large enough for his family and 2 of every kind of animal, with all the passengers inside. God would send enough rain to flood the world and destroy its wicked inhabitants. In Genesis 6, verse 9, it tells us that Noah was a righteous man, the only blameless man living on earth at the time. He consistently followed God's will and enjoyed a close relationship with him. Sensing rain in the forecast, Noah did as he was told. With his family and menagerie in the boat, God sent the rain. For 40 days straight, the whole earth was flooded, and everything but the ark and its cargo was destroyed. Noah, the ark architect. The comedian Bill Cosby says that Noah responded to God's command to build an ark with the question, "What's an ark?" This joke probably isn't too far from what actually happened. Noah was a man of incredible faith. He believed that God would flood the earth, even though he had never seen a flood. And he followed God's plan to build an ark, even though he'd never seen such a craft. In fact, Noah is in the Faith Hall of Fame, found in Hebrews 11, because he obeyed God and was made right in God's eyes, Hebrews 11:7. The Bible describes Noah as a righteous and blameless man. This doesn't mean he was perfect. He messed up at the end of his life and embarrassed himself in front of his sons, but he stood out in a world filled with evil. When the flood waters receded, the family and the animals disembarked, and God was pleased with Noah's loyalty, and he promised never to permit another flood that would destroy all of life. As a sign of this eternal promise, God invented the rainbow. Noah and his wife and his sons and their wives then set about to repopulate the earth. Next section, a bunch of babbling fools, Genesis 11. In the generations that followed Noah, the people all spoke the same language and basically lived in the same region. Together, they made great advancements. Unfortunately, they were proud of their accomplishments so that they completely ignored God. When they decided to build a huge tower as a monument to themselves and a way to get to God, God decided to mix things up a bit. He miraculously gave them different languages. Everyone wandered around jabbering until they found a group that shared the same language. This event scattered people across the earth based on their common languages. The next section is about Abraham, a man of promise. Genesis 11 through 25. The time is about 2100 BC. The world was inhabited by immoral and corrupt people, except for a man named Abraham. Despite man's wickedness, God wanted to keep the promise he made in Genesis in the Garden of Eden, to provide a way to save humankind from the penalty of sin. God chose Abraham to be the beginning of the plan that would save the world. Abraham is known for his great faith and obedience to God. He lived in the city of Ur, near the present-day Persian Gulf. At God's direction, Abraham picked up with his wife Sarah and his nephew Lot, and left his home and his friends and his pagan culture. It was God's plan to set Abraham and his descendants apart from the rest of the pagan world. God wanted a chosen people to be the recipients of God's law and Holy Scriptures, to be an example to the pagan nations of the world, and to be the lineage from which the Messiah or Savior would be born. What's in a name? Actually, their names were originally Abram and Sarai, and God made a covenant with Abraham, and he changed their names to Abraham and Sarah. Abraham means father of many. Every time someone called Abraham by his new name, Abraham would be reminded of God's promise. A promise you just got to believe. God made a promise, or a covenant, with Abraham. Because of Abraham's faithfulness, God promised that Abraham would be the father of a great nation. The promise is all the more amazing if you know that Abraham and Sarah were already well past their 70s and didn't have any children. Look up into heaven and count the stars if you can, God told Abraham. Your descendants will be like that, too many to count. Genesis 15:5. I will guarantee to make you a mighty nation, Genesis 17:2. Abraham and his descendants would be given a homeland in Canaan, now the region of Israel and Palestine. Yes, I will give you this land, Canaan, to you and your offspring forever, Genesis 17:8. God also told him that through one of Abraham's descendants, salvation would be available to all the people of the world. In Genesis 12:3, he says, all the families of earth will be blessed through you. These promises are referred to as the Abrahamic covenant. God, the original promise keeper. God kept his promise to Abraham. He moved Abraham to the land of Canaan. Sarah gave birth to a son, Isaac, when Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90. The start of a great nation had begun. Isaac was the only child of Abraham and Sarah. The covenant promises were reiterated by God to Isaac. He had twin sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob was a scoundrel in his younger years, but he later got things straight with God. He had 12 sons, and God repeated to Jacob the covenant promises that were originally made to his grandfather Abraham. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are referred to as the patriarchs. This means they were the honorable ancestors of the Hebrew nation. Give me back my miracle. The next section is titled, one of the most dramatic and instructional stories in the entire Bible is when God tested faithful Abraham by asking him to take the life of his only son Isaac and sacrifice Isaac to the Lord in Genesis 22:1-19. Why would God do such a thing? He'd already told Abraham that such a great nation would come through Isaac. Sometimes God's ways are inexplicable in human terms. God wanted to see if Abraham loved him more than the miracle gift of a son in Abraham's old age. Abraham passed the test, and God provided a substitute, a ram, which Abraham sacrificed in the place of his son. Joseph, a dreamer, saves the nation. Genesis 37-50. Jacob's 11th son, Joseph, is more connected to God than the other brothers. In fact, they threw him into a pit to kill him, but then decided to sell him into slavery. His new owners took him to Egypt. God gifted him with the ability to interpret dreams, and he came to Pharaoh's attention. The king was having nightmares, and Joseph was able to decode his dreams. Pharaoh rewarded him with the highest position in the government. Later, during a severe famine, Jacob sent his sons to Egypt to buy some food. Through Joseph, the family was reunited and saved from starvation. At the Pharaoh's invitation, Jacob's clan settled in Egypt. Next section, God was in control all along. Genesis 50 verses 19 through 20 show that Joseph recognized that God can work through the events in a person's life. Nothing catches God by surprise. He can use what looks bad and he can make it turn out for good in the end. The principle was repeated by the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. And we know that God causes everything to work together for good of those who love God and are called according to his purposes. So Romans 8:28 tells us. If there was a television show about bad things happening to good people, Joseph could be a celebrity spokesman. The life of Joseph shows that God can bring good results out of difficult circumstances. In a touching face-to-face with his brothers, Joseph tells them, "Don't be afraid of me. As far as I'm concerned, God turned into good what you meant for evil. He brought me to a high position that I have today so that I could save the lives of many people." Genesis 50, verses 19 and 20. You ought to be on Broadway, baby. It's the next section. If you think that the story of Joseph would make a good script, you're right. His life is the subject of Andrew Lloyd Webber's blockbuster musical, Joseph, and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Moses, leader and chief babysitter of a new nation. After Joseph died, the memory of his importance quickly faded. Meanwhile, the descendants of Jacob's 12 sons multiplied. Over the next 400 years, the descendants of Jacob had grown to well over 2 million. Out of fear of being overwhelmed by the Jews, the Egyptians forced them into slavery. But the more the Jews were oppressed, the more they multiplied. It got so bad that Pharaoh ordered that all newborn Jewish males must be killed by the Egyptian midwives. In the midst of the hardship and anguish, the descendants of Abraham, now called Hebrews, cried out to God to be rescued. The riverboat baby, Exodus 2, 1 through 10. Although they had forgotten him, God never forgot his chosen nation. His plans to rescue the Jews began with a Jewish baby named Moses. To avoid the death decree, the mother of Moses kept his birth a secret. When she couldn't hide him any longer, she made a papyrus basket and set him afloat in the Nile, sending his older sister to watch over what would happen. In God's design plan, Pharaoh's daughter was bathing in the Nile, and she found the basket, and she fell in love with the baby, but needed somebody who could nurse the infant. The sister leapt out of the bushes, and guess who she recommended? So Moses was allowed to be raised through his early childhood by his mother, being taught about God and the Jewish heritage until he was older, and then was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter and received a royal upbringing. How many names do they need? The descendants of Abraham are called by several different names in the Bible. They're called the Jews, the Hebrews, Israel, the children of Israel, the nation of Israel, the Israelites. Don't get confused. Each of these names refers to the same group of people. An unlikely and reluctant leader, Exodus 2:11 through 4:17. As a young man, Moses had all the trappings of an Egyptian, but he remembered his Hebrew roots. When he saw a slave master beating a Jewish slave, Moses came to the rescue and killed the Egyptian. He thought the Jews would rally around him, but they weren't ready to recognize him as a leader. Feeling estranged from the Jews and fearing Pharaoh's reprisal for the murder he had committed, Moses fled the desert, where he lived for years as a reclusive goat herder. One day, when Moses was wandering around the desert, God appeared to him in the form of a burning bush. How could he be sure this was God? Well, the bush was not consumed by fire, and it talked. Those are pretty good clues. God told Moses that he was God's chosen leader to bring the Jews out of slavery in Egypt. Whose God is greater? The plagues prove that Moses' God was greater than all the false gods of Egypt. Bible scholar William Hendrickson says it this way: the Nile, whose waters turned to blood, was considered a god. The frogs, which were swarming in the kitchen and bedrooms, received divine honors. The cattle afflicted by the later plague were objects of worship. The sun darkened around the 9th plague. It was identified as one of the Egyptian deities. And the crown prince slain during the last plague was believed to be in very close touch with the heavens. With the plagues, Moses proved that there is only one true God. Exit this way. Exodus 5:11 through 10. Following God's instructions, Moses confronted Pharaoh with the famous "God says, let my people go" speeches. It took a series of plagues to convince Pharaoh that God was serious. The plagues were subtle hints, like Egypt being invaded by grasshoppers, or the Bible calls them locusts, and the Nile being turned to blood. These plagues proved to Pharaoh that the millions of Jews that Moses and millions of Jews, These plagues proved to Moses and to millions of Jews that Moses was God's appointed representative, and that God was serious about getting his chosen nation out of slavery. It took the plagues that killed his son to convince Pharaoh to release the Jews, and the Egyptians were so glad to get rid of them and the plagues that they gave, and the Egyptians were so glad to get rid of them and the plagues that they gave them animals, gold and silver and jewels, as lovely parting gifts. Divine direction in the desert, Exodus 12:37 to 18:27. With the cloud during the day and the pillar of fire at night, God led the group of more than 2 million Jews across the desert. Pharaoh changed his mind and sent an army to recapture the Jews. When the Jews were stuck between the mountains and the Red Sea with no way to escape, 2 million people started complaining that Moses didn't have a boat. Moses confidently announced that God would deliver them from this calamity, but he had no idea how. But Moses told the people, "Do not be afraid. Just stand there where you are and watch, and the Lord rescue you. The Lord himself will fight for you. You won't have to lift a finger in your defense." Exodus 14:13 through 14. Then God miraculously caused the water of the Red Sea to separate and reveal a path to the other shore. With walls of water on each side, with the ground completely dry, the Jews crossed through the Red Sea. The Egyptian army, apparently slow to understand God's special protection of the Jews, came charging through the same pathway. But when they got halfway through, God caused the walls of seawater to let go, and Pharaoh's army drowned. With supplies running low, God miraculously provided meat and bread, called manna, and water for his chosen people while they were in the wilderness. Even with all these freebies, the Israelites kept constantly complaining about the living conditions. Laws written in stone, Exodus 19:14 through 24:18. After a 3-month trip, God led the Jews to the base of Mount Sinai. There they were supposed to rest up and get ready to invade and recapture Canaan, the land given by God to their ancestor Abraham. God's top 10 list, Old Testament version. Here is the list of 10 commandments which God gave Moses. The first 4 deal with our relationship with God, the next 6 with our relationship to others. It's a helpful distinction, but all of these affect our relationship with God. And in reality, they all affect our relationship to others. If we don't worship the true God, we are not good neighbors. It's that simple. Do not worship any other gods. Do not make any idols to worship. Do not misuse God's name. Keep the Sabbath day holy. Honor your father and your mother. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not be a false witness. And do not covet. God's top 10 list, New Testament version. Jesus said that these 10 commandments and all the other laws given by God could be summed up in 2 principles. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. Mark 12:30. And 2, love your neighbor as yourself. Mark 12:31. Metaphors you can use. The book of Moses are filled with symbolisms and foreshadowings that can help you understand the meaning of the New Testament. For example, God provided a ram for Abraham to sacrifice in the place of Isaac. The ram represents Jesus, the sacrifice God sent to die in your place. God brought Joseph through some utterly humiliating circumstances so that he could be in place to rescue his family, thereby saving the entire nation of Israel, when everyone else was starving during the famine. This is a picture of how Jesus left his privileged place in heaven to suffer death on earth in order to rescue humanity, dying in sin. Moses brought the children of Israel out of slavery. Moses' role as deliverer illustrated in advance the role of Jesus, who came to deliver all mankind from slavery to sin. God asked Moses to come up to the top of Mount Sinai alone. It was there that God gave Moses the stone tablets, which contained the 10 commandments. God gave other instructions to Moses, including how the people should deal with each other and how to perform the ceremonies for worship. This included God's famous promise that the Jews, the Mosaic covenant, that he would bless them if they obeyed him and punish them if they disobeyed. Now, if you will obey me and keep my commandments, you will be my special treasure from among all the nations of the earth. For all the earth belongs to me, and you will be to me a kingdom of priests, my holy nation. Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6. Sacred ceremonies at Sinai. Exodus 19, 1 through 40, 38, and Leviticus. During these days at camp at the base of Mount Sinai, God taught his people through Moses. He defined their purpose, which was to be his holy nation. He also gave instructions about how to build the tabernacle, which would be the temporary tent of worship until the permanent temple could be constructed in Jerusalem. The people responded by making solemn promises to obey God. Through Moses, God gave the Jews detailed rules and regulations for daily life and for worship. Civil and criminal conduct were some of those rules. These were rules about living together as a nation. There were rules about health and safety tips, including proper diet, avoiding germs and disease. There were rules about ceremonies and rituals that related to the worship of God, particularly the sacrifices, the offerings, and the festivals. From the 12 tribes descended each from Jacob's 12 sons, God chose the tribe of Levi to work in the tabernacle. From the same tribe, God chose Abraham, Moses' brother, to be a high priest. Once a year, the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle into God's presence to offer sacrifices for the sin of all the people. The high priest served as a type of middleman between God and the people. Jesus would later be called the great high priest for all those who believe in him. Hebrews 2:17 and 4:14 through 15. God's nobody. Moses spent 40 years thinking he was somebody, 40 years learning he was nobody, and 40 years discovering what God can do with a nobody. It's a quotation from Dwight Moody. It's pretty good. Whining in the wilderness. Numbers 13:1 through 14:24. During the 400 years when the Jews were in Egypt, many pagan nations had occupied the promised land. Now the Jews were going to have to invade and recapture their own homeland. In preparation for this invasion, Moses sent 12 spies to check out Canaan. The spies returned with good news and bad news. The good news was that Canaan is a land flowing with milk and honey, which is the biblical way of saying it was a great place to live. The bad news is that the cities were fortified and the inhabitants were giants, which is the Bible way of saying the residents of Canaan were very large and very mean. 10 of the spies recommended aborting the mission. The other 2, Joshua and Caleb, trusted in God's power to bring a victory. They were fired up to go ahead with the planned invasion. Unfortunately, the people sided with the cowards in what would become the pattern for the Jews for the next 1,000 years. They forgot all about how God had rescued them from slavery and the miracle of the Red Sea. They forgot about the provision of manna and quail for food. Instead, they whined and complained. They even said they would have preferred to have died as slaves in Egypt. And there's a section entitled, "What Has God Done for Me Lately?" 2 of the spies had faith that God would give them victory in the promised land. 10 of the spies were faithless. How quickly they had forgotten God's miracles in Egypt and at the Red Sea. Their faithlessness was the result of their forgetfulness. As a result of their ingratitude and unbelief, God sent the Jews wandering around the desert for 40 years until everyone over the age of 21, except Joshua and Caleb, died. Listen to his anger in these verses. "Not one of the men who saw my glory and miraculous signs I performed in Egypt and in the desert, but who disobeyed me, will ever enter this land. I promise on oath to their forefathers, no one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it." Numbers 14:22 through 23. During this time, God continued to miraculously provide for the Jews. He gave them water and food. Their shoes and clothes did not wear out. Regardless of God's provision, they continued to complain. It's a little ironic that the Jews are called the children of Israel. So much of the time, that's exactly how they acted, just like children. By the end of the 40 years, Moses gathered the Jews together for a series of sermons to remind them of God's provision. Moses was close to death, and he wanted to help the people think ahead to the future God wanted to give them. His moving sermons, collected in the book of Deuteronomy, could have been titled Lessons from the Desert. He challenges God's people to be obedient and faithful to God. Then just before he died, Moses passed the role of leadership to his great general, Joshua. What's that again? So here's a review section. The books of Moses, or the Pentateuch, explains the beginnings of the world, the human race, the Jewish nation. Genesis reveals that God created everything. He created mankind with a spiritual nature and a soul, so that we could have a relationship with him. 3. The sin flaw, which has marked human nature since Adam and Eve disobeyed God in the Garden of Eden, sent the human race on a downward spiral. Yet after the flood, God promised not to destroy the earth again out of anger. Point 4. From Genesis 12 on to the New Testament, we see God working through one family, Abraham and Sarah, their descendants to bring his salvation plan to humans. God promised Abraham that his descendants would grow into a great nation. Exodus shows that God is in the business of rescuing mankind from bondage. As he had done for Joseph, so he freed the Jews from slavery. At Mount Sinai, God gave his people the 10 Commandments and other rules for life and worship. But Numbers through Deuteronomy shows the Israelites mostly rebelling against God. They wandered in the desert, living the miserable consequences of their disobedience. Here are some of the books you can use for further study of the people, places, and events and the God of the books of Moses. And you can read those titles for yourself. Some of them are better than others, but there you have it. Then you have some questions, and then finally a moving on section that will bring us to the beginning of chapter 5 for next week. Thank you, and this is it for now.